Welcome everyone arriving. We're going to give a few moments for people to enter the Zoom room. Welcome to everyone just arriving again. We're giving folks a few moments to enter. I'm watching our attendee number go up, so we'll leave another 30 seconds before we get started. All right, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending where in the world that you're joining us from. I'm Jennifer Piscopo. I'm an associate professor of Occidental College at Los Angeles, California. So I'm joining you this morning from Los Angeles in my home office with some, what I hope you agree with me is lovely backdrop of Mexican art behind me. I'm delighted to welcome everyone this morning to the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group's launch of our call to action. I've gone ahead and put the link to our call to action in the chat. I hope you will tweet it early and I hope you will tweet it often. And in fact, we have a hashtag for this event that I'm also going to go ahead and paste in the chat that I hope you will use. So as you know, the pandemic has entered its third year, and we as the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group want to start insisting that policymakers and stakeholders take the demands that we have been raising over the course of these very difficult 2 years and start to act. And that is the purpose today of our webinar. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Let me go through the run of show very quickly for everyone. We're going to hear from Leila Sachs and Sarah Barnes, who will give us some background information about the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group, and will tell us about the call for action and how it came about. Then we're going to hear from 4 fantastic speakers whose work and thinking, both in academia and in the policy world and the activist world, have informed the call to action and elevate the call to action. And they will tell us a little bit about how their work speaks to the call for action. I will be introducing them in more in-depth later, but we are honored today to be joined by Shubha Nagesh, Nancy Madera, Kirti Nakray, and Marsha Mutambara. And I'm going to put everyone's Twitter handles in the chat box, because again, we encourage you to tweet early and tweet often. We're going to hold all the speakers to 5 minutes because we really want to have an open discussion with our 4 distinguished panelists and with the audience. So audience members, you have a Q&A and a chat box. We invite you to utilize both of those to interact with us and to pose all of your questions. And we are really excited to hear from you. So I think that's all of my housekeeping, but let me just say again that I'm really honored to have been part of the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group, part of the conference, and part of the call to action that brought all of us together. So to tell us more about those first 2 components, let me read the bios of our first 2 speakers. So we're going to hear from Leila Sachs dos Santos Gomez. She is the co-founder and acting director of Yarrow Global Consulting, a feminist organization based in Germany that works on the intersection of gender, health, and the environment. And they're actually having their own action week. So this really aligns nicely. And I encourage you to take advantage of Yarrow Consulting's events this week. Leila has over a decade of experience working in public health sector design and programming, including for city governments and labor unions, and is responsible for facilitating dialogue between civil society, policymakers, and public administration. And Sarah Barnes is the director of the Wilson Center's Maternal Health Initiative, MHI. MHI looks at the intersection of women's health, safety, and economic security, and their links to foreign policy and development. Her work focuses on women's paid and unpaid work, gender equity, maternal and reproductive health, gender-based violence, and girls' education. So welcome again, Leela and Sarah. You both have been instrumental in this whole process, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'm just going to share my screen here because we'd like to tell you a little bit about the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group and how the conference came to be. I believe you can see my slides. Can you give me a short thumbs up? Great, thanks.
Leela, we can see your slides, but you haven't gone full screen yet.
All right. I'm not sure why that is. I'll try this again. Now?
Nope, but I actually think it works just fine. They're nice and big, so I would roll with it.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the working group and about the working group conference and how this came to be. The Gender and COVID-19 Working Group is a group that came together from academics and activists throughout the world to look at the disproportionate negative impact on women and girls through the pandemic and through the lockdowns that were put in place to maintain the virus. We have about 675 health practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and advocates globally who share resources and expertise on topics related to gender equity, women's empowerment, human rights, and COVID-19. Up until now, we've met once a month, and the conference came out of these meetings in the wish to actually share ideas and to come together to talk about what we've learned from our interaction with each other and what we've learned from some of the activities that have been put in place through the last 3 years. One of the most important things about the conference and about the way that it was set up was that we wanted to put it together as a very participatory process. We wanted to have a lot of people interacting and also bringing their ideas, their views, and their positions into the setup of the conference. So not only the content, but also the design. In about November 2021, we had the idea to put together a working group conference. And then over a period of 2 months, we had a brainstorming process where we thought about what the content of the conference should be, who the participants should be, and how we wanted to design the conference. Then after we decided about the initial content and about the way that we wanted to involve speakers and also participants from the COVID-19 group, we put together a team of about 10 volunteers who had clear responsibilities about how to set up the conference. We wanted to make it, like I said, as participatory as possible, but also to bring people together from very different areas of the backgrounds, academic backgrounds, and also different activities. Finally, in February 2022, we had the implementation of the conference. We decided on two-hour sessions on consecutive days in order to be able to involve people from throughout the globe. So the conference took place from 3 till 5 on 2 consecutive days. In the end, we learned a lot from this because we were able to repeat many of the topics that we had on the first day, but with a different audience, with different visions and different participants in each of the subgroups that we had set up. And from this implementation, we then produced the call to action, which we will be talking about today. The team that we had to put together this conference was a team of highly specialized people, not only specialized in the content that they were talking about, but also in putting on online conferences, which of course was a huge help to be able to put this on with a group of volunteers. You can see the team on the left-hand side. And we also had a very strong tandem, shared responsibility with tandems. So we had a coordination, which was me and Amrita Gupta. Then we had, yes?
I'm so sorry, do you think you could advance the slides? I think we're still on the what is the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group slide.
Okay. I don't know.
This is great. There we are.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, Leela, please go ahead. It won't count it against your 5 minutes.
Okay. So on the left-hand side, you can see the team of the people who contributed to the conference. And in the middle, you can see the way that we set up the conference. So in the We had a tandem coordination team. Then we had a tandem team looking at health and health systems, a tandem team looking at governance and policy, a tandem team looking at livelihoods and care economy, and then 2 people who were responsible for the media and the design. Like I said beforehand, we had a rough conference setup of 6 rapid speakers, each of whom spoke about the 3 topics that you can see here in the middle: governance and policy, health and health systems, livelihoods and care economy. And then these were followed by 3 parallel sub-sessions, a total of 90 minutes on each of the thematic areas. So people could take part in each of these sessions. And because the conference took place over 2 days, each person had the possibility to participate in 2 sub-sessions. Each session was facilitated by lead questions, and we had the sessions recorded with note takers. From these sessions and from the notes that were taken, we were able to then devise and integrate the statements from the different subgroups and from the different rapid speakers into the call to action that we will be presenting today. And with that, I would like to give the word over to Sarah. Sarah, can you give me the thumbs up that you can now see the right slide?
Yeah, it looks good to me. Thanks, Leila. Thanks for setting me up beautifully. And thank you, Jennifer, for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here today to talk a bit about the call to action on gender and COVID-19 that came out of the larger gender and COVID-19 working group and the conference that Leila just mentioned. As Jen mentioned, I'm Sarah Barnes, and to give a little bit of a description, I have shoulder-length hair, big glasses, and a pink shirt, and I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm broadcasting today from my attic apartment in Bern, Switzerland. I came to be part of the working group through my work with the Wilson Center, which, if you're not familiar, is a DC-based think tank focused on global issues and foreign policy. And my work most recently has heavily focused on women's paid and unpaid work. This week, we launched a policy brief on the global care economy and the importance of economic and human investment to support caregivers. So this is also the space I've been working in as one of the facilitators of the Women in Work subgroup of the larger gender and COVID-19 working group, and then as a co-facilitator of the livelihoods and care economy pillar of the working group conference. Next slide, please. As Leila mentioned, the conference, and indeed I would say the entire working group as a whole, is quite a collaborative effort. So the creation of the call to action was much the same. On this slide is a list of all the note takers from the conference whose work was then utilized by the authors to create the call to action. Again, it was highly collaborative in the process where we really tried to work together and include representation across topics, as well as include various viewpoints and experiences. So a huge thank you to everyone on this slide for helping to create and disseminate this call to action. Next slide, please. Despite our varying expertise, the vast regional representation of the conference and varied topical focus across the 3 pillars, the policy and governance pillar, health and health systems pillar, and the livelihoods and the care economy pillar, we all came to a consensus on 4 main themes, and then we turned those into the 4 strategies of the call to action. But before we get to the 4 strategies, I wanted to note that our strategies and recommendations are not new. This call to action re-articulates and re-emphasizes demands made long before and throughout this entire pandemic. Also, in many instances, there are already infrastructures in place that could help realize our recommendations. And finally, a common theme from our collaborators was that we don't need more plans, we need more action. So our hope is that this call to action lends itself to the action that we seek. Next slide, please. And here we are to the heart of the matter, the call to action. Again, there's 4 strategies. So strategy 1 is to ensure diversity in gender transformative leadership in the COVID-19 response and recovery. So basically, we need better representation of women in marginalized groups in all aspects of pandemic response and recovery, including as leaders. And we need to respond to and challenge gender stereotypes in global analysis to provide fair representation in these recovery plans. Strategy 2, focus on mixed method, multi-sectoral and disaggregated data. So we must ensure that research includes women and girls and non-binary people, as well as men and boys, to more accurately illustrate the lasting effects of COVID-19. And conference attendees really stressed the need to take time to collect data and analyze data of people's lived experiences. So being sure to really include the qualitative data, particularly for women and other impacted groups. Strategy 3, address the needs of all women workers, paid and unpaid. This is another huge issue, and we have a continued need for protective and supportive policies that promote decent work opportunities and dignity for all women, with attention to their distinctive and intersecting identities. And we need to prioritize healthcare workers and care workers and invest in keeping them safe, as we've seen these workers hit particularly hard in the past 2 years plus, excuse me. And then strategy 4, invest in strengthening supportive policies and the care economy. Ensure there are supportive programs to support entry and re-entry into the paid workforce for women, particularly those who lost employment due to the pandemic, which was quite often due to the increased need of family caregiving. And related, recognize and support the unpaid contributions women make in caregiving. Some 75% of all unpaid care work globally is done by women and girls. And while 11% of recovery plans did include mention of care work, none include men as contributors of that care work. So before I get into a tangent on that topic, Leela, the final slide, please. So our speakers today will speak to their expertise and lived experience as they apply to these 4 strategies and the action we need to implement change. I also wanted to note, since we're talking about representation and diversity and gender, that people who identify as male are very much engaged in the overall working group, and we're engaged in the conference. We'd hope to have more gender diversity on our panel today, but schedules did not align. So this working group, while often focused on women and girls, does strive to really look at the effects on gender more broadly. I'm really looking forward to learning more from our panelists today, and we'll also be collecting and consolidating questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please put it in the chat or use the hashtag gender and COVID-19 on Twitter, and then I'll present questions toward the end of the hour to our panelists. Thank you, and back to you, Jen.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I'm just adding that hashtag again to the chat. I hope people are following along, and I really want to underscore what Sarah said, which is that the overwhelming consensus from the conference that we all participated in was that we have the plans, we have the toolkits, we have the blueprints, we have the road mapping strategies, and we are really trying to demand in the pandemic's 3rd year some action. So I want to turn now to 4 fantastic speakers who are on the ground in academia and as activists, as policymakers, sometimes as all 3, doing the important empirical, qualitative, and quantitative research that informs the strategies that Sarah just laid out. I'm going to read all of their bios together in order to just facilitate the transition across the 4 speakers. So first, we are going to hear from Shubha Nagesh. Dr. Shubha Nagesh is the Chapter Development Manager of the Asia Pacific and Middle East at Women in Global Health. She is a medical doctor, public health specialist, and writer working at the intersection of gender, disability, and global health. And she has more than a decade of experience developing and implementing community-based programs for children with developmental disabilities in the Indian Himalayan region. Welcome, Dr. Nagesh. Second, we will hear from Nancy Madera. Nancy Madera is a sociologist and doctoral candidate in political science at the National University of General San Martin in Argentina. Her research focuses on comparative gender politics, in particular violence against women, with a special focus on Latin America. We're so excited to have you join us, Nancy. Third, we will hear from Kirtina Cray. Kirtina Cray is a professor at Jindal Global Law School and adjunct faculty at the Center for Ethics at Yenepoya University in Mangalore. She has published extensively on women, unpaid work, and care, and recently completed a research project funded by the International Growth Center entitled Gender-Based Violence and Empowerment Indicators in Bihar, Scope for Evidence-Based Research and Policy. Welcome, Kirti. You have been a fantastic support and also one of the co-facilitators and organizers of the conference. And fourth, we will hear from Dr. Marsha Mutambara. Dr. Mutambara is a postdoctoral research fellow focused on gender, sexuality, human security, and migration. She works with HERD, working to advance health equity in Africa, And her research focuses on how different systemic and social structures construct the unique experience of marginalized and minority groups in South African society. Welcome so much, Marcia. So we'll begin with Shubha. Dr. Nagesh, please.
Thank you. I'm wearing a yellow shirt with orange flowers. I have black hair and brown skin. My background is a combination of 2 shades of green and mentions women in global health. And I'm connecting from the Himalayan state of India, Uttarakhand. So social groups are neither homogeneous nor static, and intersectional approaches recognize this complexity by taking historical, social, cultural, and political contexts into account. So intersectional approaches help us to understand the differentiated nature of vulnerability and resilience. And intersectionality emphasizes the constant renegotiation of power relations and how individuals and groups can experience both power and oppression simultaneously. People with intersecting discriminations include those with coexisting social identities of disadvantage, namely race, social class, ageism, disability, sexual orientation, etc. They are disconnected from services in the best of times. Never before have intersecting vulnerabilities been more stark than in the last 2 years during COVID. And these intersecting vulnerabilities make a compelling case for universal health coverage. In this context, I would like to share 3 key lessons. 1, we can no longer treat men or women as homogeneous groups. We need to understand well the intersecting vulnerabilities to identify the differential health needs and the differential health risks of particular groups, and to be able to address them with appropriate policy measures. The case of women and girls with disabilities makes that quite clear. Amongst those with disabilities, women and girls face systemic barriers to equality and inclusion, with limited visibility in both disability and gender equality laws, policies, and practices. Available data suggests that women with disabilities are 3 times more likely to have unmet needs for healthcare, 3 times more likely to be illiterate, and 2 times less likely to be employed. Second, the MDGs apply to low and middle income countries, but the SDGs are more universal. So universal health coverage applies as much to the United States as it does to Mozambique. COVID exposed deep inequalities, not just between countries, but also within countries. For example, greater mortality by race in some countries, lowest status jobs which tend to be more frontline, or less access to healthcare when people have to pay for it. Third, independence, dignity, and safety are most crucial to women who are standing at intersections. And this can only be achieved through participation, collective action, decision-making, and emphasis on proper implementation. So the COVID pandemic taught us, among other things, the vital importance of being gender equal in difficult and ordinary times. So here are 3 things that we can do or must do to get this right in the next health emergency. 1, embed equity-centered inclusive approaches in crisis, community-based health, and social protection responses. This has the potential to mitigate the psycho-emotional toll on vulnerable people and promote resilience. 2, ensure sex disaggregated data are collected to understand the impact of COVID-19 on violence against women and girls to inform the response. Because without data, policymakers are working blind. Data disaggregation must also be relevant to the context. Race is a big divide and is relevant in the global north. Caste is far more important in India. Disability is a critical indicator everywhere. And third, we need to incorporate a gender perspective at all levels of our budgetary processes. We need to restructure revenues and expenditures to promote gender equality. In conclusion, we need to address the specific gender defects of the current pandemic and lay out steps for a long-term gender-just recovery. We need to put women at the center of policy change and solutions. This call to action re-articulates and re-emphasizes demands which were made long before and throughout the pandemic. There are already structures in place that could realize them. Countless governmental and non-governmental organizations have issued gender-responsive COVID-19 blueprints, toolkits, and recommendations. We do not need more plans. What we need is action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagesh. That was really inspiring. And I'd like to turn it over now to Nancy Madera.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for your presentation, and to all the organizers for the invitation. My presentation today, as the last time I was here in the conference, is based on a team research project with dear colleagues from the Giga Institute in Hamburg. And I'm going to be sharing with you in the chat an article we published last year with some findings on this, if you're interested to know a bit more of our work. So the call to action addresses the gendered and intersecting nature of vulnerabilities of women. The vulnerability to an experience of gender-based violence varies according to different forms of discrimination and inequalities that affect women. When policies are not sensitive to this intersectional nature of violence, they further deepen the vulnerability of already marginalized groups by limiting their access to support and justice services. In Latin America, we found variation in how states responded to gender-based violence during the pandemic. In some cases, states were reactive to the issue, their actions spurred by demands from feminist and women's organizations, as well as human rights international agencies. In other cases, responses were more proactive, emerging from gender policy institutions with a robust infrastructure on gender-based violence, such as in the case of Peru, or a new government with a feminist agenda and feminist officials in key state and government positions, such as the case of Argentina. In countries where the head of government were openly dismissive of gender-based violence as a problem, such as in Mexico, or had an agenda with a traditional and family-oriented approach to violence, such as in Brazil, existing gender institutions across branches and levels of government, next to and with the collaboration of the feminist and women organizations, were key in promoting a state response to gender-based violence. Some Latin American countries show greater sensitivity toward the intersectional nature of gender-based violence by implementing inclusive prevention campaigns, providing support to indigenous women, migrant women, and women and vulnerable people in detention, as well as adopting support and social policies directed to LGBTI+ population. We also observe that services across the region tend to concentrate in urban areas. Strategies to bring services closer to the people who cannot reach these services, as rural and marginalized populations are rare. And sometimes services require mobile phones and internet connections that are inaccessible to many. Services not always set up to provide services in different languages, including indigenous languages, or to assist women and people with disabilities. The instability of resources to fund and improve gender-based violence services, and the lack of coordination between ministries and levels of government, which is a key problem, especially in federal countries, also limits the positive impact of state responses to gender-based violence. The COVID pandemic showed that despite normative, institutional, and policy advancements in recent decades, the need to mainstream a human rights, gender, and intersectional perspective into state responses to gender-based violence remains a challenge, both in service provision and in emergency plans for high-risk contexts. As the call for action highlights, data collection and open access to information, sufficient and stable funding, as well as coordination are key elements to encourage a more proactive, a more accountable state response to violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Really fantastic work from all of our speakers. And now we're going to go to our second set of speakers. And Leila will facilitate by sharing the slides. And first we'll hear from Kirti McRae. Kirti, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity that I have to share some of my perspectives with my wonderful colleagues across the world. And it has been a great opportunity for me to share some of my insights from my recent research. I'm Kirti, and I'm currently wearing a peach shirt, and I have long hair and I wear thick glasses. And in the background, you might hear some children playing, or or some trumpet blowing, because I'm currently working from home. The global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has been a big moment in the global history, because it has reversed some of the impact, some of the impressive advances that women's movement had made. Next. Women's movement had made, and also we have seen that our advances towards the achievement of sustainable goals have turned the clocks back, because we saw that gender equality and decent work really took a back step when the global pandemic hit us and there were lockdowns. Next. Specifically, I would like to draw attention to ILO's Building Forward Fairer policy brief, which shared that in 2021, there were 13 million lesser women in the workforce as compared to in 2019. And in 2021, employment for men started seeing a recovery, but the recovery for women's employment was rather slow. And why was this the case? Women's employment suffered because of lockdowns, because often the nature of women's work meant also suffered a lot, because many women are in the informal economy. And also the lack of gender sensitive recovery can also be attributed to the excessive time that women have to dedicate to care work, caring for elderly, disabled, or for the children, which is often not recognized or remunerated. Also, women don't have access, either have very poor access to social protection or have no social protection also. And during the global pandemic, we also saw a upsurge in the violence against women, both in the workspaces and in homes. In workspaces, we saw the increase in the prevalence of digital violence, which hit women much harder than it hit men. Next. As my colleagues have already mentioned, that the women who were worst affected often belong to vulnerable groups such as racial, caste minorities, or ethnic minorities. Often the aboriginal groups or non-binary groups are the worst sufferers when any disaster hits, and COVID-19 was no different than that. As a social policy academic, my research largely focuses on social policies which will enable or retain women in the workforce. And I look at different social policies, and what we saw, that what will bring women back into the workforce is also the availability of range of policy supports, support such as early childhood centers or childcare facilities for children from all different age groups. We need also very supportive school environments, which not only provide children with good education, but also excellent care and nutritional support for children, so that a little bit of burden on women is reduced. And also what we need is improved facilities for victims of domestic violence and sexual harassment, and the availability of legal aid, so that women are in a position to walk out at an earlier stage from abusive homes and work environment. And often we don't pay enough attention to the fiscal side of gender budgeting, that is policies such as tax incentives and subsidies for firms which have more progressive attitude towards women. Now, these firms could be both in the formal and the informal economy. And the underlying point that most of my research makes is that we need to recognize all women as workers and all their work as indispensable for economic recovery. We will have to go beyond looking at the binaries or silos of formal and informal work within the household, or the work within the firms. And that is, I think that is the first step towards a gender sensitive economic recovery. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. McRae. And we will now hear from Dr. Mutambara. Welcome, Dr. Mutambara.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. As mentioned, my name is Marcia. I'm wearing a black toque, and then my background is white. As my colleague has already mentioned, you might hear some background noises as well. children playing, I'm working from home. So I'm going to be presenting on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the livelihoods of women refugees or asylum seekers in South Africa. Next. So just to give a little bit of background context, you realize that South Africa, unlike other asylum seeker receiving countries, has got an urban refugee policy. What do we mean when we're talking of an urban refugee policy? We mean that when refugees and asylum seekers get into the country, they're not put into detention centers or wait to be put into the general public, but then they immediately settle in the cities and they can start on with their lives. And to find out, most people actually, like in the African continent, want to come to South Africa and seek refuge in South Africa. However, it actually also has its own disadvantages in the terms of most of them are actually involved in informal trading because of systematic challenges with their documents, or most of them, they do not get to be involved in formally paid work because they end up doing informal trading. So you find out with the effects of the pandemic, it has had unequal impacts. It has impacted women around the world, and asylum seekers and refugees have experienced negative impacts of the pandemic, which include the sudden loss of income. And you find that because they were actually like working in informal trading spaces, they don't have that liberty of maybe working from home as those who are formally employed. So linked to their precarious employment situations, you find that they face economic insecurities, and that have always been evident. And what the pandemic has actually done is actually deepen or worsen these situations. So gender inequalities intersect with the lack of formal economic social protections, creating structures which result in amplified economic exploitation and loss of income. Next. Next. Okay. So one of the impacts of one of the silent impacts of the pandemic has been unprotected labor and the immediate cessation of jobs. Like I've already mentioned, most of them, they're involved in informal trading or informal businesses. So once those restrictions were put in place, most of them, they stopped going to work, or they did not get their wages. And in most cases, they actually lost their jobs. And I think the next point, this one is a silent point, and it has been continuing. Even now, we might want to say that the COVID is now sort of ended. It's like the aftermath of the pandemic. Yes, health practitioners will say COVID is still out there, but then people are sort of eased into it. But one of the silent impacts has been the frequent occurrence of xenophobic violence that has affected their livelihoods. So when you're looking at in contextual background, over the years, South Africa has always had the challenge with xenophobic violence. So you can imagine that when the pandemic now started, everybody was affected, but both the locals, both the asylum seekers and refugees, and the lockdowns actually made it difficult for everyone. But now, especially after the lockdowns, there's been a rise of anti-immigration campaigns, in particular like this operation called Operation Dudula, which has gained traction on social media with the hashtag Put South Africans First, and it has since found expression on the ground, consequently making it challenging for asylum seekers to continue working on the informal trading jobs. So you find that because most of them would be involved maybe in selling on the streets or working in saloons or opening up informal shops, because of that, these operations will go around closing those areas, and most women will be involved in this kind of informal businesses. But because of these operations, it has made it terribly difficult for them to continue working. Next. Still on the same point of the xenophobic violence, I think it is important for me to mention that, like a few days back, there was an informal trading policy that was actually put in place just to say that, like in one of the major cities, to say that the municipality was going to relook at the policy which talks about giving permits to informal traders and putting the South Africans or the locals first, and then leaving out the refugees or asylum seekers or migrants from other countries. So I think this is a situation that has made it very terrible for asylum and refugee women in terms of paid work and informal work. So the other issue as well is temporary closure of immigration administrations during the pandemic. It actually prevented asylum seekers and refugee women from renewing their permits or renewing their asylum claims. And it actually made it difficult for them and excluded them to getting assistance from the government. And the lack of valid legal resident documents mean that many refugees have been unable to access benefits which may have been put in place to mitigate against the negative impacts of the pandemic. Next. So what are the solutions to support women refugees in South Africa? And I think the call to action has already touched on some of these important solutions that can be put into place. And like my colleagues have already alluded to, I think the best solution is we need more action now, because I think we know the solutions, that we know the ways that we're supposed to go, but then we now need more action. So there is a need for development of program interventions that strengthen the sustainability of refugees, women's livelihoods, intervention programs that take into account the realities of women refugees. So there's also a need for inclusion of refugees in social protection services, like government responses to mitigate the pandemic should take an inclusive approach that considers the impacts of the pandemic on all individuals in different social locations and positions. And I think it is important that these interventions have to be sustainable. Let's say in the event that they're going to be cash transfers given to people, those cash transfers should not only help them in that particular time, but then they should also be solutions that are sustainable. And the other thing is fostering positive public perceptions of refugees is actually key to addressing these xenophobic challenges and achieving economic impact. Without the public support of the population, it will be very difficult for governments to enact generous economic inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mutambara. And thank you, everyone. I'm going to remind everyone, you're going to be tired of hearing these reminders, that we are again connecting to our call to action and our hashtag in the chat. And we are so grateful. And I want to amplify that all of these speakers, and I don't have my video on, there we go. You can see me again. I want to emphasize that the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group is a voluntary group, and all of these speakers are dedicating their own time to these events, to the call to action, to joining us in these webinars and generously sharing their research. And I think it really speaks to the urgency that we want to continue to place on this issue. And to that end, since we do have some time, I wanted to ask all the speakers a really important question. So from where I'm sitting in the United States, it seems like I'm losing my mind, because I think 99% of the people I'm surrounded with have declared the pandemic to be over. And that is not what I am experiencing personally. And I don't believe that is what women, girls, marginalized groups, those at the intersection of gender and other vulnerabilities are experiencing. So I think a key question that I would like to know, and our audience would like to know, if I could ask just each panelist to give us their hot take in 45 seconds, how can we continue to keep focus on these important issues with this national or even global rush to declare that things are back to normal and that the pandemic is over? I'd like to start, if I may, Dr. Nagesh.
Thank you. I don't think the pandemic is over at all, particularly not for us who are in the low and middle income countries. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, where has all this led us? Global inequity, whether it is access to PPE, vaccines, services, women frontline workers still exposed to risk. 30% of the population in India probably still hasn't had their first vaccine. And it also is leading to so much national and global inequity. Occupational segregation, women are clustered to lower status, lower paid jobs, told that they're essential, but most of them are feeling they're expendable. So I think the last thing I would like to talk about is we cannot not but talk about the great resignation. There is so much burnout, especially of women. So many women health workers are planning to leave the health profession. And people like us have turned hoarse asking for equality in leadership. And why? Because we know that women are the experts in health systems, and we know that when women lead, good health follows. Thank you.
Nancy?
Yes, well, as Dr. Mutambara mentioned, and I think that is very important to keep focus on in this during and after the pandemic, is how inequalities have deepened and have been exposed by this context, and is key to be to continue demanding for better services and specialized services, for example, for gender-based violence, but we need to push also, and I think feminist movements and women's organizations and marginalized groups is to continue promoting for a better social and welfare state. So social policies are key, universal income, cash transfers, so everything that can help reduce inequality, and so for me the most important is to continue focusing on showing how the pandemic has affected an already very unequal situation and has making it worse, and that continues to be a reality today, and we need to continue focusing on how to change that.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think especially this emphasis on the importance of strong welfare states and the important ways that governments can act to protect marginalized groups. And in fact, they did act in the early stages of the pandemic. And it's really about insisting that those policies remain and become strengthened. That's so important. Thank you so much. Kirti.
Thank you very much. I think the effects and the after effects of the pandemic are going to be felt for another decade, because not only I just mentioned that 13 million women have not gone back to work since the pandemic started. We don't know enough what is happening with these women. We don't have enough data about the number of children left orphan. We don't have enough data which helps us connects the dot about what is happening with women, what is happening with children. We don't know enough about vulnerable groups. We don't know enough about the informal economy. So even though I think a group like ours should keep the focus on the pandemic and its effects, and also the other forms of pandemic that are still happening and the lockdowns that are still happening in some countries. We don't know enough. I think we need to keep the focus on the pandemic and its effects on women, and also the intersectionality and the vulnerability of certain groups of people to harsh public health policies as well. I think we need to use this opportunity to engender health systems and social policy systems as well. And I say this with a lot of thought, because I also come from a country which has one of the lowest female labor force participation. And I think we need to keep the focus, and we need to keep going. And I think a platform like this is excellent for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nakray and Dr. Mutambara.
I think I agree with all of my colleagues when they say that this pandemic has actually has long-term effects on women. So I think for me, I think we just need to keep on demanding for better services. And I actually agree with Katie when she says that we need to continue doing more qualitative research, looking at the experiences of these marginalized groups. Because like now, for me, I understand that, yes, they've had their situations, but because of the pandemic, those situations have actually deepened. And it's actually important for us to continue to find ways and do research that is actually going to inform policies on how best to help these marginalized groups.
Thank you so much for that. And I think there's a question coming in the chat, coming in the Q&A that I actually think is about the question of gender disaggregated data and looking at data for older women as well as along other axes of marginalization. I'd actually like to invite all of the panelists to reflect on this, and I'll use chair's privilege to say, I think on the one hand, right, as many of you just said, we need better gender data. We deeply know the importance of gender disaggregated data along all lines of marginality to better understand the experiences of diverse women, diverse girls, non-binary individuals. But on the other hand, we also know that sometimes, in my view, calls for better data are calls that policymakers use to excuse their inaction or delay their inaction or put off inaction. So one question, I'm picking up on the question at the chat, how can we balance our calls for more data, which we want to truly reflect the experiences of all groups, without sort of feeding the calls for more data that are used as inaction and delay by those with power? And I'd actually like to go in reverse order and turn the floor over to Marcia.
Can you please repeat the question for me, Jennifer?
Of course. How do we balance the need for gender disaggregated data for the important reasons of reflecting the experience of diverse groups with the fact that calls for more data are sometimes used as excuses to delay or not to act?
Yeah, I think I agree with the person who's also also put this question to say that, you know what, calls to say that there's a need for disaggregated data is like an excuse. But I think it's important to just start for me, I think it's important to start working with the data that is there, because that's the information that is coming up. And I think it is important to start working with that data that is there. Like for research, I think it's an evolving thing. And you know, when you're doing qualitative research, it's not like you're going to get all the information in one go, but then you're going to get information later, probably after a few months. You know how long it takes. So I feel like we need to continue, starting with the data, collecting data is the first step, and going ahead to find solutions with the data that we have at the moment, and it continues to evolve. So like what Kitty said, you know what, we don't really need to stop with the gender and working COVID group, because there's other issues that are actually arising from this, and there's emerging data that continues to come up from this.
Thank you. Kirti.
Yeah, I think that's why I think that I think data is deeply political and policy is deeply political. And I think that's where the women's movement and the alignment between
So sorry, Kirti, you've accidentally been muted. I'm trying to problem solve that.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll just start from the beginning. I think data is political and so is policy. And I think that's where the alignment between academics, researchers, and the women's movement is very important, and bringing on table all the stakeholders who can make the right noise, and also understanding the difficulty of collecting data with vulnerable groups, especially in countries, low and middle income countries, where our systems are not developed, in the sense we don't have very robust data sets on non-binary groups, or even, as a matter of fact, we don't have enough information about say certain caste group or ethnic minorities. So that's where I think the participatory approaches to policy making development matters. And I think what Nancy mentioned in terms of federal systems is very important, which it allows information at where it allows stakeholder engagement at very decentralized levels, whether it is local self-governments or village panchayats. Now, we know in India that some of these institutions work in some spaces and they don't work in some places. But we do need to be very creative and innovative, and we need to involve stakeholders in policy making and decentralization of governance, and engage at different levels of policy makers. And mixed methods research is the way ahead if we really want to highlight intersectional vulnerabilities, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirti. And now we'll go to Nancy. And Nancy, we also received a question just for you that I think really follows nicely on Kirti's comments, which was about the importance of civil society and government collaboration and actually advancing change, for instance, through Argentina's recent liberalization of abortion. So maybe, Nancy, if you could reflect both on the question about how we need and call for gender data, and then also this point about the importance of civil society and government collaboration and how we sustain that moving forward. I know we just gave you a lot, so thank you.
No, thank you. And well, your question is fantastic. I don't have really a proper answer for the balance between, I mean, the need for data and also the use of data, the lack of data as inaction for government. What we have seen, I mean, we are, for our research, we are navigating so many different sources to collect data, and sometimes one service, or to find out how many shelters are in a country, or how many places are available in these shelters. I mean, these data should be open, should be known, so we can see what the gaps are, so we can understand what the experience of women and other groups that look for help get. So we using data to see how sometimes unavailable these services are, even if they are present. So I don't have a proper answer, but I would say states cannot hide behind not having data for action, because it's part of the responsibility towards gender equality and towards gender-based violence to produce that data and to inform about what they are doing and to be accountable for it. And there's like human rights agreements that they have to fulfill, and we have that to push for and demand for open access to information. And the second question regarding social organizations and government collaboration, what you see in terms of gender-based violence in Latin America is you cannot understand not any of the advancements if you don't see the action of social organizations, particularly feminist and women's movements, but also the action of feminists within the state, inside the state, in different places, in the legislative power, in the executive power, in the judiciary, in subnational governments. So the other day I hear a dear colleague, Mariana Caminotti, talking about feminists outside and inside the state, and that this division is not as clear cut as sometimes we observe, that feminist ideas and people who promote these are outside and inside the state, and then this is what gives this movement the strength, particularly in Latin America. We cannot understand this without social organizations and the push and the demand and the always active demand for accountability for states on gender-based violence. I don't know if I answer, but I can continue trying if there's more questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We are at our hour, so I'm going to ask the final concluding question that's come in through the chat from Haley Stewart, and I'll ask everyone to wrap up with 30 seconds. Unfortunately, we lost Shubha, Dr. Nagesh. If she is able to rejoin, we'll make sure to include her in this final round. But the final question that we would like all of our participants to briefly reflect on, all of our panelists to briefly reflect on, what can participants, those listening, do to help further the recommendations outlined in the call to action, and how do we get our call to action out there? And so actually, I'm going to start with you, Kirti, Dr. McCrae, because you were very involved in the planning of the Gender COVID-19 conference from the beginning. So please.
I think we need to kind of leverage our strengths, and I think we need to network very strongly, and we need to kind of make our social media and media presence felt very strongly, so that we are not we are kind of keeping the spotlight on the gendered effects of COVID-19 and the need for recovery plans which address women's the key issues that women have faced, and especially the vulnerable groups as well. And we need to kind of keep on the network, and we need to work at different levels, at academic level, at research level, and we need to work on advocacy strategies as well, and we need to work together as a team and bring in all our strengths. And we need to keep in mind that we are a global movement, and we are geographically diverse, and we represent the diversity of the global feminist movement, and we need to keep up the momentum, and we need to come together again regularly. Thank you.
That's so inspiring. I know that I have really learned from colleagues across the globe whom I did not know before the pandemic started. And that has been so valuable for our connections, our advocacy, and our mobilization. Thank you, Kirti. Marcia.
Yeah, for me, I think I agree with what Kiri has just said, just improving on, it's not to improve as such, but just to keep on with the social media presence, because I think most of the people will get to pick up on those issues with the social media. I think just keeping up with the social media presence for them to know about the intersecting vulnerabilities for marginalized women, or even women or across the globe, and just the advocacy as well, just to continue advocating for the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Nancy.
I agree with everything my colleagues in the panel said, particularly to keep the momentum going, to keep. I mean, the pandemic was a huge challenge for everybody, but it also showed how we can put and maintain topics in the agenda that weren't there at the beginning of the pandemic. So these issues were not part of the general plans when COVID started, but are definitely in the agenda now. And they need to be in the agenda for the future context with crisis, in climate crisis, and other kinds of challenging situations. So to keep the momentum going, to keep the networks going, and these spaces that are so fulfilling and fantastic to participate in.
Thank you so much. Leela and Sarah, do you have any final views?
I would just jump in to say thank you so much to everyone. This was really exciting and definitely inspiring. So thank you, and we will all stay very much connected. Jennifer, I liked how you put that. I definitely feel like I have a global community through this working group. So thank you all very much.
Leela?
Yes, I can only agree. Sarah's working from her attic. I'm working from my cellar. And I think that all of us have children in the background. And I think that's one of the things that we learned from the pandemic, is that basically with all the bad things that happened, we were really able to have set up a global community. And I'm sure that our topics and our energy will continue into the follow-up and the continuation of the pandemic. So thank you to all of you. And I hope to see you again soon.
And I want to underscore my thanks. I want to close by acknowledging some of the folks that are either not here or in the background. Dr. Rosemary Morgan, who really leads the Gender and COVID Working Group. And even though we are a network of more than 600 individuals, thanks to Rosemary at Johns Hopkins, we stay organized. I want to thank Haley Stewart and Kate Hawkins, who provided a lot of support for this webinar in the background, a lot of technical recommendations. They have really been in charge of our social media feed, all the wonderful graphics and mock-ups that you see of the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group's reports. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has labored in the background, often for free, to make sure that the voices of all of the affected individuals by COVID are heard. And I am very grateful for all of your time. And thank you all to our attendees for listening. And I hope you will stay in touch. And I'm going to end the recording and send everyone about their day.